welcome everybody. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the work of Hilary Keegan. And it's an intensely personal therapeutic journey of self-discovery and a cry of outrage at gendered social conditioning. Hilary has based her content on both religion and fairy tales, as both of these genres didactically promote a discourse that attempts to restrict and control women in an effort to make them conform to a patriarchal agenda. These modes of indoctrination reduce women to stereotypical binary opposites of good and evil, or sacred and profane, personified in Mary and Eve. As a child, Hilary was taught that in order to attain the purity of Mary, she must physically renounce or remove anything that might cause her to deviate from her goal. The formative influence of such messages has led her and many other women to try and deny aspects of their humanity in order to live up to an impossible ideal exemplified by the Virgin Mary. But as feminist Julia Kristeva points out, who on earth can be a wife, a mother, and a virgin? Because fairy tales are usually presented in the form of a journey or a task that must be undertaken, Hilary has laid out her exhibition to express the stages of her mental journey towards wholeness and integration. She's framed her work using the 3 cycles of Arnold van Gennep's rites of passage to mirror the stages of transition. And I'm going to approach this a little bit like a gallery walkabout and address each of the stages in turn to explain their importance in her journey. So the first one over here is called Deconstruction Cycle, Ironing Board Altars for Mary and Eve. Here, Hilary must separate herself from her past and the religious and social programming that has fractured her sense of self. Unlike altars dedicated to a male god, these follow the ancient practice of women who constructed home altars, often to a female deity. Each one is subversively informed by intimate and personal issues that run counter to the grand narratives of organized religion. The ironing board substrate that you see in these little panels refers to the socially expected state of female domesticity, but the images on them are explorations of the Mary and Eve myths and their unsuitability for contemporary lived experience. For example, if you look at the Mary panels, and those are the ones in blue, each one has the silhouette of a Mary statuette that was owned by Hilary's mother. You can see the shape of it here. Okay. Inside each silhouette is a partial, poorly fitted, and erratically cropped image. And each one has 3 different members of her family. That's her mum, that's her sister, and there's Hilary in that one. The ill-fitting subjects indicate how a template of the Virgin Mary is not suitable for the real lived experience of womanhood. Hilary's bloodied Eves, in between them, demonstrate their profane status resulting from their role in the fall of mankind by expressing the subversive nature of what Kristeva has termed abjection. To this end, they are less definite than the crisp outline of Mary's silhouette as they blend into the background, and they're covered in what Hilary calls blood flowers, made of molten wax, which disrupts their borders and breaks the aesthetic wholeness required for patriarchal approval. Below these panels, you can see a series of extraordinary deconstructed shoes, referring to the story of Karen in the Red Shoes by Hans Christian Andersen. And in short, the story goes like this. Karen refused to wear sensible black shoes to church, but instead she succumbed to vanity and bought red shoes. Now, these red shoes, when she put them on, were enchanted and made her dance endlessly, without rest, without food, for days, until she begged a woodsman to chop off her feet. Once the part of her that caused her to sin had been removed, she became remorseful, meek, submissive, pious, and was eventually welcomed back into the church and her family. In other words, her independence and her joyous free spirit was curtailed, and she became the meek doormat required by both church and society. You can see clearly Hilary's response to this outcome in the deformation and pain expressed in these shoes. They are placed in perspex boxes reminiscent of Snow White's glass coffin. Bear in mind that Snow White, like Eve, was tempted by an apple, and like Eve, she suffered mortality as a result. Bear in mind also that the older woman, the crone, was the tempter, the evil woman, who is equated in this way with Satan. As we know, Snow White was rescued by a man and became the submissive ideal wife. So the indoctrination continues and stereotypes are entrenched. Now here, this wall is phase 2. This is the reconstruction cycle. It's a series of semi-narrative paintings which show the liminal stages in the rites of passage, the in-between, where nothing is certain and everything is possible, where the binary stereotypes that we have encountered in Mary and Eve can transition into a composite and whole persona. You will see the figures existing in liminal spaces, hovering in indeterminate, dreamlike landscapes. The scenes segue from an empty Colosseum up at the top, where perhaps Christians were martyred for their faith, to ominously towering, shadowed cityscapes or a watery vista with a boat in the last panel. We are made aware of the journey that must be undertaken from one state to the next, as our gaze is drawn from painting to painting. Liminality is expressed in the lack of coherent narrative and in the characters themselves, who could be fairy tale figures. Both the crone and the young girl are present as Hilary's alter egos, but the young girl is also a pig. Here you have the young girl, there you've got the pig entering the space. The pig is an animal identified in the Bible, in Leviticus, as unclean and untouchable, so it metaphorically expresses the profane aspects of the girl. Sometimes we see the pig with the girl's shadow. Sometimes they are companions in their journey through these panels towards the final stages of transition. The crone is similarly an integral part of this transitional persona. You can see her in the last but one panel up at the top. The crone is similarly an integral part of this transitional persona and will ultimately be reintegrated into a composite whole in the final cycle. Now, the incorporation cycle is the one on the back wall. This is an altarpiece, which marks the third and the final stage in this rite of passage, where the symbolism of the body is reconfigured so that sacred and profane can coexist. This piece is deliberately placed opposite the deconstructed shoe altars to set up a dialogue with the Mary and Eve stereotypes that you see over here. Fragments of other works are included in each of the side panels in those little square blocks, and they're accompanied by a knife alluding to the piecemeal symbolic cutting away of the sinful parts of the body and psyche that is required for purity. On the other side, you can also see building tools. Now, these fragments, these little pieces of images, speak of the fragmented self that is now made whole in the center, where sacred and profane are now incorporated. The boat cradles the central figures like a mandala or a unifying frame. The profane pig is now steering the boat, while Hilary is engaged in the process of sewing the fragmented parts together, indicating that this final stage is not the end, but an ongoing process. Sorry, got the wrong page. Hilary explains that the works provide a space within which she could integrate complex and nuanced aspects of the feminine that would otherwise be reviled and rejected as profane. The end result is an extremely beautiful and thought-provoking exhibition, and I believe that it demonstrates a process of reintegration that might be viewed as therapeutic and therefore of value, not only to Hilary herself, but also to other women. Thank you.